The hardest choices require the strongest wills.
Who doesn't love a good villain? Dastardly, scheming, manipulative, unpredictable, sometimes convinced of their own righteousness, sometimes just here to watch the world burn, a good antagonist can be the making of a story. But what of those villains who have an unexpected change of heart? Those who decide for whatever reason that maybe world domination can wait. In this video, we look at 10 villains who, in one form or another, decided to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Spoilers abound!
It is too late for me, son.
Throughout the Star Wars trilogy, an obscure art house series that has achieved cult status over the years, Darth Vader is an unknowable, terrifying force. Casually choking enemies, underlings, and colleagues alike, the imposing Dark Lord of the Sith seems to positively revel in being, well, a villain. So what changes at the climax of the third movie in the trilogy, Return of the Jedi, when Darth Vader decides to destroy his master, the Emperor, sealing his own doom in the process? Well, we'd argue that the Jedi formerly known as Anakin Skywalker, Annie to his friends, of whom he has none, probably doesn't care about the greater good. What he cares about is his son, Luke. A far more powerful and personal motivator than an abstract struggle for control of space. And let's be honest, he's probably just sick of his boss. I mean, who among us hasn't idly considered throwing our boss down a big hole at some point or another? Relatable stuff from Vader. The recent Planet of the Apes reboot trilogy is, in our minds, an underappreciated modern blockbuster series. A big special effects-driven trilogy where the characters are so nuanced and likable that you start to dread the action set pieces because you don't want any of your faves to get hurt. The apes themselves are a real achievement. They're all complex characters with rich inner lives, trying to make their way in a violent world. One of the most fascinating is Red, an evolved gorilla and staunch ally of Koba. By the end of War for the Planet of the Apes, the third movie in the trilogy, Red has become disillusioned with the constant conflict, and near the climax of the movie, he chooses to save the life of the protagonist, Caesar, even though he knows that he will be shot for doing so. As a result of Red's sacrifice, Caesar is able to destroy the base and set the other apes free. A noble end for a fascinatingly layered antagonist. Some, perhaps controversially, argue that Spider-Man 2 represents the pinnacle of superhero filmmaking. Some are probably rushing to leave a furious comment right now because they vehemently disagree. Hey, don't get angry with us, we've got no horse in this race. But, whatever your opinion, we think most would agree that Alfred Molina's Dr. Otto Octavius is a fantastic villain, both on a character level and a visual level. Look at those tentacles, man! For much of the movie, Doc Ock is driven by a combination of grief and the malign influence of his tentacles. And it's only in the end, when Peter Parker reveals his true identity and begs him not to go through with his deranged scheme, that he starts to see the light. And in true self-sacrificial fashion, he is prepared to go to the bottom of the river in order to stop the fusion core from exploding. A tragic but fitting end. Not all villains are focused on world domination or mass murder. Anton Ego, one of the villains of Pixar's Ratatouille, is simply a food critic who loves the power his writing gives him over the restaurants where he eats. A man who has seemingly forgotten about the true pleasures of food, as he is so intoxicated by his ability to shut down restaurants and ruin chefs' careers, it is only an encounter with a plate of ratatouille prepared by a rat chef who is not named Ratatouille that changes his mind. And what a change! The taste of the simple dish and a subsequent conversation with the rat chef, who we have to stress is not named Ratatouille, is enough to send Anton Ego shooting back to his childhood, softening his heart and changing his perspective on food. The subsequent glowing review he writes ultimately destroys his career and reputation, but the experience has rejuvenated him. From the sublime to the ridiculous, let's say up front that Hannibal Lecter does not have the capacity for redemption. He has no interest in it for a start, but we also need to remember that the guy is a straight-up monster, an inhuman cannibal who loves to destroy people just for the fun of it. So, let's bear that in mind when discussing the climax of Ridley Scott's bonkers Silence of the Lambs sequel, Hannibal. Lecter doesn't learn a lesson. He doesn't care about the greater good. He doesn't fundamentally change as a character, but he does make an important choice. Lecter and Agent Clarice Starling are handcuffed together, and Lecter knows that the FBI will put him away forever if they catch him, an idea that he finds intolerable. But he chooses to cut off his own hand in order to escape rather than harm Clarice. A small thing, granted, when you consider that 15 minutes earlier Lecter was happily feeding a guy his own brains, but you know, it's all relative. Killing oneself has rarely been as literal as it is here at the climax of Avengers Endgame. A reformed future version of Nebula kills her past self. Though not her actual past self, because that would mean that the future version could never exist. It's a version of her past self from a branching timeline, but it also is her past self, so all intents and purposes? Except it isn't, quite. Anyway, Nebula is low-key one of the most tragic characters in the MCU. A traumatized victim of Thanos, tortured and mutilated for his amusement, and pitted against a sister who always had the edge over her. Her journey from psychotic henchwoman to conflicted, reluctant hero is a complex one, and the murder of her past self to save her sister's life may not be a particularly subtle resolution, but it's certainly an emotional and memorable one. Oh, we could spend a whole video arguing about whether Mad Max Fury Road's Nux is actually a villain at all, or if, much like Nebula, he's just a misguided victim doing the wrong thing in order to survive. Whatever your take, the former war boy is certainly an antagonistic feature for Max at the beginning of the movie, and his character arc is a fascinating one. As with so much of Fury Road, themes are left unspoken or only hinted at. Everything is defined through actions, both the actions of the characters and the, well, action. Nux has been conditioned to believe that it is the highest glory to sacrifice one's life and be welcomed into Valhalla. Interestingly, this belief is not exactly changed by the end of the movie. All that has changed is that rather than sacrificing himself for the evil Immortan Joe, Nux sacrifices himself for his new friends so that they may live. He has learned to value life, even though he knows his own life has to end. Now, very few people would argue that A View to a Kill is the best of the classic Bond movies. It's not even the best of the Roger Moore Bond movies. But if there's one pretty unambiguous high point, it's the legendary Grace Jones as henchwoman Mayday who does the bidding of Walken's villainous Max Zorin. Whether it's skydiving off the Eiffel Tower, strangling a guy in a Rolls Royce, or just standing around looking terrifying, Jones puts in an iconic performance, even though she has very little to say. She's also key to averting Zorin's lunatic scheme at the end. Furious at her boss's betrayal, Mayday chooses to divert his bomb away from its target, even though she knows she won't get out of it alive. Now that's a view to a kill. We think. Hold up, what the heck does that actually mean? Blade Runner's Roy Batty, played brilliantly by the late Rutger Hauer, is another example of a villain who you could argue isn't technically a villain. Sure, he does horrible things over the course of the movie and before the movie even starts, but you could easily make the case that he's been driven to such violent acts by the abuse and violence that has been leveled against him and his kind. And his actions at the end of the movie show that there is a more complex being underneath the raw power and violence. He chooses to save Deckard's life and spends the last few moments of his own life quietly talking about the things he's seen with the man sent to kill him. Did Batty decide he simply didn't want to die alone? Did he want somebody to bear witness to his final moments as proof that he existed? Or maybe he'd been planning that Tears in Rain speech for a while and didn't want to waste it on an empty rooftop. Oh, as far as bad guys go, it's hard to get more evil than the Prince of Darkness himself. The fallen angel, the morning star, the literal devil. But one of many interesting choices made by Trey Parker and Matt Stone in South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut is to make Satan a layered, even sympathetic character. It's a pretty blunt joke in a way. Hey, Saddam Hussein is worse than the actual devil. Who would have expected that come the big climax, when the hordes of darkness are laying waste to planet Earth and the final battle between good and evil is nigh, that Satan would decide to throw his co-conspirator down a big hole and bring it all to a close? Throwing his evil co-conspirator down a big hole. Sounds a bit like the first entry in this list.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme. Every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one.
But what about Snape, we hear you ask? What about Severus Snape? Why isn't Professor Severus Snape from Harry Potter in this list? Because he was never a real villain. That's why. He was undercover the whole time. Plus, we forgot about him. Sorry. See you next time!